Thanks, Mark, and thanks everybody for joining this session, and thanks to Solace in particular for inviting us to be part of this event. My name is Matt Aslett. I'm the VP and Research Director at Ventana Research, and I'm going to be speaking initially today about data mesh and where it meets event mesh. So data mesh is the latest buzzword to sweep the data and analytics industry. And I remember it was probably only sort of 3 or 4 years ago, being at an event, hearing Zhamak Dehghani speaking about the concept, and immediately was struck by it being a really interesting proposition and something that had potentially large impact, but not being entirely clear about whether or to the extent to which organizations would pick it up and how quickly they would pick it up. Fast forward to today, and it seems suddenly every vendor is talking about data mesh, and most organizations have heard of the term data mesh. The details on that are few and far between for many organizations, however. So, what exactly is it? Why would you use one? How do you adopt one? And what are the benefits and challenges that need to be considered? And, those are the questions that I'll be hoping to answer, or at least pointing you in the direction of the answers in this presentation. So the best person to turn to for a definition of data mesh is the person I already mentioned, Zhamak Dehghani, Director of Emerging Technologies at ThoughtWorks, who actually came up with the concept. And she's in the process of writing a book about data mesh, and is doing so in the public. So you can go and see the chapters as they're being written. So this is a quote here, which I took from that book, in the process of it being written, as I said, and she describes data mesh specifically as a socio-technical approach to share, access, and manage analytical data in complex and large-scale environments within or across organizations. So I think there's a few things to tease out there, and the most important for me is that data mesh refers less to the technology that's used to share, access, and manage data, and rather more to the ownership of the data and the metadata. The premise being that different sets of data and metadata should be managed and owned by different people and different domain experts within an organization, and make that data available to others across the company. So there are 4 key data mesh principles that Zhamak talks about that will help organizations understand what's different about data mesh and start thinking about how they can apply this to their organization. And I'll talk about each of those in turn, but they do all overlap and influence each other as well. But the first of those is domain-oriented data ownership. And this is the idea that a domain, business unit, department, or perhaps even a region within an organization takes responsibility and ownership of the data that's generated within that domain. And they do so to ensure that the data is fit for purpose for their own use cases, but also that it is made available to others across the organization as well. And that is then the second aspect here, or principle, which is data as a product. So, it's not just about that department, business unit using data for their own purposes or generating data for their own purposes. Clearly, there are use cases across an organization where data needs to be combined, where other business units have needs from data from other departments and domains. And so the way that is enabled in a data mesh environment is through those data sets being made available as a product that can be accessed by other domains across the organization. The third aspect, which is clearly how that is done, is through a self-service data platform. Now, obviously, a lot of organizations have moved in recent years towards more self-service analytics. This is a bit of a step beyond that. It's not just about self-service access to data for analysis, but self-service access to that data as a product, to access that data, to query that data, potentially to combine that data with other data products and produce new data products. And then the fourth element is federated governance. So, in order to achieve all of this, clearly there needs to be a strong focus on data standards and governance across the organization. And that is done in a federated manner. So a lot of organizations have previously taken a more of a top-down approach to data governance. Here, obviously, you don't want complete autonomy of those domains. So you need to move to a more federated approach to data governance. And there's multiple benefits that potentially organizations can gain from data mesh. This list is not necessarily a sort of a prioritization, but there's, just a look at the multiple ways that the organizations can gain benefit. Clearly one of the key areas that if we think about giving different domains responsibility and ownership of their data is empowering them, giving them the power to create new analytics projects, to do new investments without necessarily having to rely on other parts of the business creating, analytic infrastructure and projects for them. Also, because we're talking here about data being made available as a product and data sharing being a key element here, it's very much an approach that can encourage collaboration across different domains and business units. And I already talked about the potential to combine data sets, facilitating aggregation of data across the organization. Also, preventing data silos. This is a key problem that many organizations have had for many years and have tried different approaches to solving. And I suppose in some ways, the idea of the data mesh and domain ownership kind of suggests more silos. But of course, because the concept of sharing, the concept of data as a product is built in from the start, this is an approach which is designed to enable data to be shared across an organization, even within those business units having ownership of their data, and to prevent duplication of data, to prevent effort, to prevent arguments about who owns the latest version of a particular data set. Potentially, there's the opportunity here to reduce cost of ownership as well, in terms of reducing that duplication of effort, duplication of infrastructure as well, in order to support multiple copies of data. And obviously, clearly, there is a requirement, but also it's a potential benefit in terms of reinforcing the use of consistent policies and standards across the organization in terms of how data is stored and processed and analyzed. Now, those are some of the benefits, but I'm sure people are already thinking about the challenges that could be involved in that. And the data mesh does absolutely potentially require organizational and cultural change. And depending on the nature of your organization, that change could be significant. Again, to quote Zhamak, she talks about data mesh calling for a fundamental shift in our assumptions, architecture, technical solutions, and social structure of organizations in how we manage, use, and own analytical data. So this isn't necessarily going to be simple. And for a lot of organizations, it is going to take them to think very differently about, not just data ownership, but data access and responsibility across the organization. We're talking about here about a shift from centralized ownership of data and standards and infrastructure to a more decentralized approach. We're talking about moving perhaps from a monolithic architecture. We've seen in the years gone by, a lot of organizations attempting at least to create, a single source of the truth and a single data warehouse or data lake. We're moving here towards much more distributed architecture. We already talked about, the previous approach to top-down governance and shifting towards a more federated governance model. And obviously, as we said as well, instead of thinking about data as an asset that's controlled by perhaps a domain, data as a product which is owned by a domain, but made available for other business units to take advantage of as well. So there are further challenges that come along with that, in addition to that cultural change. I've already touched on this. Clearly there is a requirement here for interoperability standards. If domains are responsible for their own data, then interoperability standards are going to be required to enable access to and sharing of data across domains. It also requires disciplined data governance. I talked about this. Data governance is federated, but not distributed. So there's an element here. There is a collective responsibility. We're not talking about giving those domains complete autonomy in terms of how they govern data, in terms of security and privacy enforcement and things like metadata management. Those still needed to be determined at sort of the organizational level and then federated out to the domain. So that, there's some intricacies there in terms of how organizations approach that, clearly on a cultural level, but also that in that governance policies absolutely need to be well codified and potentially automated as well in order to do that in an efficient manner. As I mentioned, we've seen attitudes to data governance changing in recent years anyway. And I think data mesh is both sort of a beneficiary of that and also is contributing to it. And we see here one of our market assertions for this year. We see that through 2025, data governance functionality will continue to be a significant priority for data platform vendors to enable self-service data discovery, analytics, and greater business agility. So governance is evolving anyway, but data mesh absolutely is a forcing function on that. Further challenges we see, this kind of environment is going to require monitoring and enforcement of data quality service levels. Each business unit or domain will have to ensure that the data is cleansed and deduplicated and enriched and all those other aspects of data quality so that it can be consumed by other domains without them needing to get involved in downstream replication and cleansing efforts of their own. In order to do that, there needs to be not just enforcement of data quality rules and policies, but potentially some service levels being applied to ensure that everybody is keeping up with what is expected of them. It also potentially requires some technological evolution. So I already said that data mesh is about a concept rather than the technology itself, but clearly we see, I already mentioned, there's the shift here to more self-service data as a product. That may require an investment in new technologies to deliver that. There's certainly going to be some aspects of facilitating that in a more efficient manner. Clearly, already talked about collaboration being an important factor here. Again, many organizations may be pretty good at collaboration, but there are some that won't, particularly within the business units. And so there may be need for investment in technologies to facilitate that as well. And then federated governance, already talked about. Clearly, it's anything that is a potentially different approach to how things are being done today, may require investment in new technologies to actually enable that. The data mesh is platform agnostic, which is a benefit, perhaps because existing technologies can be reused, particularly existing data repositories. So your existing databases, data warehouses, data lakes can continue to exist within a data mesh environment. And I think that's something that there's a little bit of confusion on. And because the data mesh is a truly distributed environment, and many of those technologies have been about centralization of data, there's an assumption that they can't fit together. But I think I've seen this with organizations where what they've done is apply the data mesh as an organizational concept on top of the existing or alongside their existing technology. So that is a benefit, but it's also a challenge because organizations need to think differently about how they make use of those technologies. And it also is a challenge because it means the definition of sort of data mesh, or the use of the term data mesh, let's say, is open to misuse or abuse, or it's open to vendors coming in with their own take on what data mesh is, particularly in terms of trying to sell quick fixes and products that deliver on some of these capabilities. And a significant challenge is there is no quick fix for creating a data mesh. It is a cultural and organizational change that is enabled potentially by investment in new technologies. Data mesh is not available off the shelf. And, buyer beware in particular of vendors trying to sell you a product that can deliver a data mesh. Obviously, lots of vendors out there have products that can help you create and deliver a data mesh, but there is no data mesh product. So if any, beware of anybody who's trying to sell you one, because it's snake oil, at least at this point. But more importantly, I think one of the key concepts of the data mesh is about moving away from defining your data strategy in terms of your data platform. Your data warehouse, your data lake house, whatever it might be, is not your data strategy. And I think this is a problem that lots of organizations have fallen into and have actually continued to repeat as the underlying data platforms evolve, is thinking about their data strategy in terms of the platforms they are using. And I think this is what struck me initially, all those years ago, about data mesh and why it was interesting, is that it creates an abstraction between your strategy as an organization to take advantage of data and use analytics more efficiently within your organization, and the technology and the data platforms which help you do that. And so, that is a key element. It also means that obviously some self-assembly is going to be required. You're going to be using multiple technologies to deliver on this. So what are the key components? Well, one of the key considerations, I've already said, there's multiple platforms that could be used, and that will very much depend on existing relationships, existing investments, and obviously organizations want to make best use of what they already have. But one of the key areas that companies need to think about here is how you provide access to domain-oriented data products. And really, I think there's two key approaches to that, and they can be best surmised as sort of push and pull. So you think about a part of an organization, let's say, for example, that deals particularly with customers. So they own the customer list and the customer database, and they could make that available as a data product. As that customer database is updated, potentially those changes could be distributed, could be pushed out to other parts of the organization via an event mesh, as events that are pushed out as they change. Alternatively, you could make that customer database available, and you could obviously update it on an ongoing basis, and then parts of the business could come and pull data or pull their analysis from that environment as and when it was required, through creating sort of SQL or spinning up SQL query engines to then do their analysis of that data, as I said, as it makes sense for them to do so for their needs, and perhaps even to combine with other data that they have or from other parts of the organization. Now, I think it's important, whilst I said that those are the two key sort of approaches as I see it, that they're not mutually exclusive. Clearly, there are some parts of the business that may require a constant update of that customer list, and we'll need to know in real time as that customer list changes. There are other parts of the business where they just, as and when they need it, they want to go, and as long as they know it's up to date at that point, that will be good enough for their needs. So even within a single domain, there will be multiple ways in which they need to provide access to that data. And indeed, I think offering multiple approaches to accessing data is indeed key to the concept of data mesh as well. So frequency of analysis is going to be one of the key ways in which organizations can think about this. More frequent analysis requires organizations to reduce the time taken to make decisions based on data, shrinking the time between the generation of data and insights. We see that less than a quarter of organizations today say they're analyzing data in real time. I think if that business or indeed a specific domain has a need for analyzing data in real time, then the event-based approach will make sense in that case. As I said, perhaps for other parts of the business, the need is not so, or the need for free analysis is not so frequent, and you can look at other approaches. So I know as we continue here, we're going to talk in more detail about event mesh itself and the role that it has to play as an enabler of data mesh. But I think it's interesting in the context of this description, and again, I'm quoting Zermatt here, and she talks about business facts being best presented as business domain events that can be stored and served as distributed logs of time-stamped events for any authorized consumer to access. So I think, you know, clearly the paradigm of events is integral to data mesh. You know, those events may actually trigger query-based access to a data product rather than, you know, being event-based access. But clearly, either way, events and event-driven architecture has a significant role to play in enabling data mesh. And again, you know, one of our market assertions, you know, that we made this year, we see that through 2026, approaches to data operations will continue to evolve as organizations adapt their cultural and organizational approaches to data ownership in the context of event-driven architecture and microservices. So, you know, I think it's important here, you've got this concept of the data mesh, you've got the, you know, organizations moving towards event-driven architecture and microservices. The two clearly overlap and can draw from each other. You know, they're not, as I said, you don't need to adopt event-driven architecture, perhaps to adopt data mesh, but it clearly is a key part of the concept. And we see that many organizations who are moving towards event-driven architecture are more attracted to data mesh as well. So, you know, the two are definitely sort of, you know, trends that are running in parallel and overlapping. So just to sum up here with just a sort of a key recommendation for organizations, you know, we'd say, you know, and this is often, you know, the case, consider the business benefits and the technology requirements. And also I think importantly in relation to data mesh, because it is an organizational concept, consider them separately, but in unison, if you like. So all organizations should should consider the potential advantages that may result from adopting a data mesh approach. And maybe you look at it and you figure out it's not for you, but I think, you know, it's definitely a very interesting concept that has many potential benefits, and it's well worth consideration. Of course, you know, if you're looking at the potential benefits, you have to do so while being cognizant of that it is going to involve potentially significant organizational and cultural changes. And you can consider those organizational, cultural changes separately from technological change, particularly in relation to the fact that you know, data mesh does enable you to potentially make ongoing use of existing investments in data platforms. But I think beware of the cultural and organizational approaches to data ownership in the context of ongoing evolution of data architecture and the adoption of event-driven architecture and microservices in particular. And with that, I'll thank you for your time. There's there's a lot of links here. If you're interested in learning more about our approach to analytics and data and our research, or, you know, finding us on social media, please do so. But with that, I will hand you back to Mark. So thank you very much for your time.